Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Well, this is the fourth Tuesday of the month. I never know what day it is, which means it's time for Age Well to Move Well. No, Move Well to Age Well. I think you could go either way with our resident plant-based physical therapist, Eileen Kopsaftis. And today we're going to focus on the hips, painful hips, and what to do about it. Please welcome Eileen back to the show. It's so great to see you. You're just a very popular guest because everybody has a body part that hurts.
That's for sure. We've got a lot of body parts, right?
Absolutely.
As we get older, it tends to increase in number, and people want to know what to do about it. That's the important part.
Absolutely. Well, I got to tell you, since you've been on the show, I personally know people that have seen you privately, and they are just thrilled with the results they're having.
Yeah. Well, you draw amazing people. They're wonderful people. I love talking with your audience and interacting with them. And everybody is just so nice and kind and respectful and pleasant. It's a beautiful thing to behold.
Yeah, and maybe it's because we're all vegan, but who knows? So hips, I'm interested in your talk today because I actually many years ago had a problem. It was called greater trochanter pain syndrome, I think it was called, in my right hip.
They didn't just call it trochanteric bursitis. Usually that's what they...
Well, that's what he called it. And then there was like a needle this long and he put it in me and I was like, oh my God. But I mean, it did help. But I could barely walk. I mean, I remember it was really painful when I had it.
Yeah, and that is a very common issue with the hip. Very common. Yeah. So what I wanted to focus on today was how to train the hip. Really not, I mean, obviously addressing pain is always very important, but my focus for today was kind of more on aging well, because a lot of people, as they get older, they lose strength. They struggle to get out of a chair. They, struggle to get out of a car. And I think the last time I was here, I might have even mentioned, if you go to sit down and you plop that last couple of inches, it's time to do something about it, right? Don't wait until you need help to get up out of the chair. So that was why originally I had titled this Your Power Source. Obviously, I can go into, I could do another one on hips, where it's really more about specific pain issues and why they happen and what can be done about it. And that would be a little bit more in depth in that area. Obviously, what I teach today can also very much impact people's pain in a real positive way. So it'll be kind of a twofer for today, right? We'll get
nice. Well, we can always learn something.
Yes. All right. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we will get started. I've got a few slides, and we'll cover these. Won't take long, and then I'm going to move down to the gym and show some movements. So, as I said, we were talking about this, age strong, your power source. Most people would have absolutely no clue what that was. And, they might not understand what we're talking about here. So obviously putting the word hip in there is probably a good idea. Sometimes I'm so inside the bottle, I can't read the label, right? So, I put this here. I kind of changed this up a little bit from what I usually say about being a good healthcare consumer, which Dr. McDougall is very good at teaching, right? But understanding authentic human function. This is really my wheelhouse, my passion, my reason for, my raison d'etre, right? Understanding authentic human function leads to better training choices, because a lot of people are doing things to their bodies in the gym, at home, even with a well-meaning but kind of misinformed personal trainer. And I'm not attacking personal trainers, because some of them are jaw-droppingly excellent at what they do. But every profession has those, the bell curve, right? My profession, those who are kind of mediocre in the middle, those who are really, really good, and those who might want to, take a few more classes. So, we all have that, right? But we want to be making better training choices so we have improved results. And so today I'm going to teach on some anatomy of the hip, specifically related to the fact that it is our power source and what that means, and why that can lead to pain in the knees, pain in the low back, pain in the neck, pain in the shoulders. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we're limited in time, and I want to show some movements and some training. But I also, because, we do live in the land of litigation, I have to make sure everybody knows that I'm not advising anybody. I'm not treating anybody. I'm not telling anybody to disregard anything they've been told by a healthcare professional, right? It's very important that people are safe and they do what's best for them, right? And then this is just a little reminder from the last time I was here. Physical inactivity is our biggest enemy in today's world because everything is so automated, everything is so technological run, everything is just push a button. I'll never forget when my younger daughters were little, actually all four of my children, I used cloth diapers and everybody thought I was crazy. You know, they stared at me with these. I'm like, I didn't want to put those chemical laden things on their little bodies. You know, I mean, you could soak, how many cups of urine could be soaked up in one of those things, in that gel? What was that doing to their body? So I used organic cotton diapers and everybody would look at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, I'm pouring them in a machine and I'm pressing a button. I'm not going down to the river and beating them with a rock, right? I mean, we've got a real high technology world. So physical inactivity is something we have to really pay attention to, because diet alone is not enough. We must move. And if we're moving, we can actually increase our lifespan. And I had talked about it being the fountain of youth the last time, right? And this is really good news because it puts us in control. It's not about fate or, oh, I guess as I age, I'm going to have these problems or whatever, right? So my goal here is to teach on how the hip is your power source. And if you do have pain, if you do have problems, you know, I promise I'll do a show that'll go specifically into medical conditions and issues and anatomical issues and all that kind of stuff. But this is going to really help people to understand the function of the hip, what it's designed to do in the body. And then, as I said, they're going to make better training choices, right? Maybe even better rehabilitation choices. And I put this together here to show some different aspects of why the hip is so important. I mean, you can see this picture up here. I mean, look at the power here. The gluteus maximus, it's the biggest, most powerful muscle in the body. It's the reason we can push open a heavy door. It's not the strength in our arms. And of course, there's that whole, you know, Newton's law of motion where, you know, every action requires an equal and opposite reaction. So as you push open a heavy door, your feet are pushing into the floor and it's your glutes that are providing that power so that you can push into the floor strong enough to push open a heavy door. It's not your arms that you're using. And I've had people tell me, oh, my arms are so weak, I can't push open a heavy door. And I go, it's not your arms, right? You've lost your power source. And so, and you can see how Max here comes down in. Here's the greater trochanter you were talking about. You had issues there, right? You've got these big, powerful muscles, these very tensile fascial structures that that perform a lot of function and power right at that area, because that's what your max is attached to. That's what your piriformis is attached to. That greater trochanter is a big bump on the outside of the hip bone. And when I stop sharing my screen, I'll show you on Betty Bones here. But it's, you know, a lot of people have trochanteric bursitis. A lot of people have a lot of pain there. But it's not because there's a problem there. It's because the muscles that attach to it are not performing properly. There's this abnormal pull that's creating inflammation and pain. And that's why a shot can sometimes really address the pain issue, because it's medically manipulating the inflammation. But we really want to train the body so that everything is functioning properly around that inflamed area so that the problem gets addressed, the cause of the problem gets addressed, not just the symptom, right? And then you can see down here, you know, here's Max, but you've got all these other, you've got gluteus medius, you've got gluteus minimus, right? And you've got your side muscles, you've got all these muscles around the hip that create power. And I also wanted to share this little video. Everybody's wondering, like, why do you have the pelvic floor there? Well, your hips radically impact your pelvic floor. And if your hips aren't functioning right, it increases your risk of needing disposable underwear. And nobody wants those. So if you're training your hips properly, it will reduce your risk of having incontinence, especially as you age. You know, anybody who's sitting and they've lost the strength in their hips, they're wheelchair bound, they're bed bound, whatever, they become incontinent. So, and I'd be happy to do a show on that at some point. So this is the last anatomy picture I'm going to show. As I said, here's Max, and you can see the fibers of Max, how it's diagonal, right? So what this means is that Max functions in all three planes of motion, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. And then, of course, you've got your medius, and you've got I used to call them the gemellus brothers. You got superior and inferior gemellus. You've got all these little rotator muscles in here, and they all have a job to do, right? And the power that comes from your hips is what allows you to squat, to squat down and get something out from under the sink, to bend forward and get something out from the trunk of your car. Your low back is not meant to take the brunt of that. Your low back can be the strongest link in the body if you're feeding it properly from above and below, which means the hips and the trunk. So it's really important to understand how to train your hips. And you can see these angles. So Max works really well in all three planes of motion. You can see your hamstrings here. You've got two, one on the inside, one on the outside. They control rotation at the knee, but they also, attach up here at the sits bone, the ischial tuberosity, your literal butt bone that you sit on. A lot of people have pain here, and the hamstrings just aren't performing properly, and they think, oh, it's because they're tight and they want to stretch them. Well, what if your hamstrings are like the guide wires trying to stabilize an unstable pelvis because you've got a weak power source? So it would behoove you to train your hips in a way that restores the power, right? Authentic human function. So, and I'm going to do just a couple of slides here on some facts, and then we'll get ready to go downstairs. So your hips allow your trunk, right, between your neck and your low back, your shoulders and your legs to be powerful and successful in pretty much everything you do, right? In daily life and in sports, if you're athletic, maybe you do a lot of heavy gardening, that kind of thing, or your job, your occupation. And then I'm kind of terming them inaccurate. This is something I learned back in college, and that was decades ago. And we learn more and more. Agonist and antagonist was something that was taught, and it's sort of falling out of favor as anatomists are getting more and more understanding of function of the body, because a lot of the study that was done originally on the body was done on dead bodies, and dead bodies don't move. There's no function going on. And so what they're doing is they're seeing where the muscle attaches at both ends, and then they're figuring out, oh, if that muscle shortens, this movement happens. And if this movement happens, then that muscle over there has to not work because it won't allow that movement to happen. It has to kind of relax. So that's what that agonist and antagonist means. If I was to do a bicep curl, my triceps need to relax to allow that bicep curl because they have to get longer. But what if they're getting longer to eccentrically control a motion? Those things can actually work at the same time. So it's not really accurate when we're talking about muscle function in functional activities, especially with the hips. And then your hip actually gets loaded and unloaded in all three planes of motion, which I'll explain in a moment. The function, your hips allow the ability to turn your abdominal muscles on for enhanced core function. And a lot of that happens with rotation. If your hips aren't really good at rotation, it's going to minimize the impact of training your abs, your core function. And then your hips are also the motors in golf swing. I've had people tell me that, I should be a golf coach because they got really better in their golf game. And I laugh because I've never played real golf. I've only played mini golf. I'm pretty good at it. I can get some holes in one. But the reason that her golf score improved is because I restored her rotation in her hips, right, with her training. So, and then conscious awareness. It has to be transformed into subconscious reaction. So if you're consciously thinking about a muscle as you're exercising it, and you're mentally sort of connecting to it and getting it to do something, that's not really authentic human function, because muscles are designed to react subconsciously to movement once it's been initiated. And once that happens, you're at a much lower risk for injury, and your rehab is going to go much more effective, right? So your hips, as I said, are the power source of your body in all forms of function, including everything I've listed here, right? Walking, running, pushing, pulling, throwing, catching, swinging, punching, jumping, and landing. Your hips are the power source for all of those activities. So it really makes sense to train them authentically. And your hips are also a potential cause and or potential compensation of dysfunction, because if something else in the body isn't working right, the hips might be compensating. If the hips aren't working right, something else is compensating. So it's really important to train them properly. And functional training is understanding how your body works efficiently and then figuring out who's messing up the efficiency. We want to find the cause. We don't want to beat up the victim, because everything's connected to everything else. So before I go downstairs and show you movements, I want to make sure that you are safe to do this, that you check with whoever is responsible for your healthcare, making sure that you don't have any reasons that you should not be doing this. Always be safe, right? Now, are your hips doing some kind of compensatory pattern in major muscle groups, or are major muscle groups causing your hips to compensate, right? Now, these are the 3 planes of motion that I'm performing here for hips. This is adduction, this is abduction, this is extension of the right hip, and this is flexion of the left hip. We've got external rotation of the right hip here, internal rotation of the left hip. So these are all the motions and what's happening, right? If you can go through all these motions fully mobile, fully stable, then you're golden. All is good. But if you can't, then it's time to look and see what's going on. And this is a very simple way of explaining 3-plane motion. We move forward and back, right? We bend forward, we bend backward, that's sagittal. We move sideways, that's frontal. And we rotate, that's transverse. And you want to reestablish strength and pain-free movement in all of those things. And I just wanted to quickly tell everybody that I know I mentioned this the last time, but the Reverse Aging Bootcamp, which is absolutely free, starts the 30th. So if anybody's interested in joining me, it's 5 days of learning authentic human function and lots of other great things. And my intention is to have people moving like they're 10 years younger at the end of the 5 days. So that's my intention. Now, I just want to show you briefly on Betty Bones here. That's the sit bone, right? We sit on that. If you can see it, we sit on that sit bone. And a lot of the times people have pain sitting there. And that's where that hamstring's attaching. That's where all the big muscles are attaching. And you can see there's the greater trochanter. Well, this isn't really anatomically accurate. It is ideally a little bit lower, but it's a big bump. And we have big bumps on our bones to provide a really strong grip of a muscle that performs a lot of movement and requires a lot of power. We've got all these little bumps on our bones, and it's where those muscles that are worked the most, that are relied on the most, so they've got a good, strong grip. So that's why the greater trochanter tends to be the area where people have pain, and a lot of injections occur there. A lot of treatment occurs there, and that's why. But I can, easily do one on hip issues, right, on another time. So do we want to answer any questions before I go to the gym?
Oh, do you want to answer the questions now, or you want to do it at the end, maybe? Because the questions are not necessarily on the hip. They're just ones that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. We'll wait to the end then. That sounds fine. Okay. I need like 20 seconds. And
okay, I'll talk to everybody. Hello, everybody. How are you? I don't know if you guys heard that we're getting ready for the demonstration, that if you send me the receipt to the purchase of this book, even if you bought it a long time ago, I'll send you an incredible bonus. It's an almost 2-hour class that I sell for $25 of me cooking 5 decadent dairy-free recipes, including the strawberry chocolate cheesecake. So all you have to do is send your Amazon receipt or any receipt to chefajbonus@yahoo.com. Even if you bought it a long time ago, you can always check your order history in Amazon. If you didn't buy it on Amazon, that receipt. And if you, or you can send a picture of you holding the book if you really can't find your receipt, and we'd be happy to send you the amazing bonus. So please help a sister out. All right, we're in her gym now.
There we go. Helps to unmute. All right. Everything good? Can you hear me? See me? Okay. All right. So So we really want to talk about your hips being your power source. And a lot of the times the hips that not being trained authentically can lead to pain and dysfunction in the hips and lead to problems. And knowing how to train them authentically can reverse a lot of issues and help to resolve a lot of painful issues, right? No matter what's going on in the hips, if you train them correctly, they're going to improve pretty much. You can almost guarantee it. So let's, what I want to do is kind of mention how, the hips, 3 planes, right? So as I showed in the still pictures, but it's easier to look at motion. So when I do this, what I'm doing is I'm extending that hip. And when I step back and I bow down into it, I'm flexing it. So that's that sagittal plane motion. And then the one that I talked about, adduction, that's when I cross over. So when the leg goes to midline, and when I move away, that's abduction. So each of these movements is working a different area of the hip, but because I'm standing up and I'm using my whole body, all of my hips are working. And here's the funny part. Oh, let me finish with rotation. I didn't mention that one. So if I turn in, that's internal rotation. And if I turn out, that's external rotation, right? Now, there's a big difference between weight-bearing and non-weight-bearing motion of the hip. If I was to lay on a treatment table in a PT clinic and the PT moved my leg around to see the mobility of my hip joint, that only says what passive mobility I have. It doesn't really tell the whole picture of what's my hip doing when it has to bear weight and transition from one position to another, right? So it's a very small part of the puzzle. We need to see what's happening when you're actually weight bearing. So, I mean, for instance, if I pick my foot up, right, I can turn it out, that's external. I can turn it in, right? I can flex, I can extend, I can abduct, I can adduct, but it's not bearing weight. So it's not telling me, can the muscle control the motion once I get started? And I'll explain it in a very simple task like walking. When I go to put my heel on the ground, everything's happening from the ground up, and I won't get into all the complexities of that because that would take another hour. But the point is, when I do that, this hip is flexing because it's moving forward. This hip is extending because it's moving backward. But as I pick this foot up, because of gravity, my hip has to maintain a nice level position, or I'm going to limp, right? As soon as I pick this foot up, if that hip does that, and we've all seen people, that means that I have no frontal plane control in my outer hip. So there's no power there. That hip has lost strength, power. It's very weak, and it's not keeping my pelvis level when I pick a foot up. So that's frontal plane motion. That frontal plane control is happening. When I initiate movement, all of my muscles are controlling the movement by getting longer and making sure the movement is correct so that nothing gets injured, nothing gets hurt. Now, of course, if the muscles aren't performing right because they're weak or they're compensating, that's a whole different issue, right? Then with every single step, you're going to be creating irritation, bothering structures, preventing, potential itises, right? All the inflammation and stuff. So that's the, you're moving forward and back when you walk, you've got that sideways component going on, but you've also got rotation. When I bring this foot forward, this hip is rotating. It has to. I mean, if you want to stand up, for those of you who are at home, if you swing a leg forward, if my left leg swings forward, I'm rotating to the right on my right hip. I have to in order to swing that leg forward. And so that's rotation, right? And it has to happen. Now, the interesting part is my trunk will do the opposite rotation. So when this leg swings forward, the opposite arm swings forward. And if you swing your right arm to the left, your trunk is rotating left. But if you swing your left leg forward, your pelvis is rotating right. So you're getting that beautiful kind of a, I'm exaggerating it, right? Because I don't have much room here to walk. I can't just walk normal in front of the camera. But all these actions are happening when you walk. So if your hips have lost strength, if they've lost power, none of those actions are going to happen properly. So I'm going to show people, just a brief, like 3 or 4 movements that are going to help you to start training your hips authentically and making sure that your power source is performing well. And remember, this is just a beginning, right? There's depending on where you're at, you may need a lot more progression. You might be somebody who's really, really fit, and all of this is really simple, but sometimes people who are really, really fit get really shocked at how quickly their muscles fatigue when they do some of these movements, because their body's been compensating, right? Because they're kind of overusing some muscles that are really powerful because other muscles aren't really doing their job. We want to restore the efficiency of the movement, right? Everything's connected to everything else. So I usually start off with people restoring the back hip max, making sure max is working well. And so what we're going to do is what I call chair squats. And I may have shown these before, but I never know who sees what show. And this is really important to do. So if you have your knees against a chair, so that if you go forward, you're working your quads, right? And a lot of people have knee issues, so they don't really like that anyway. And we're trying to work max. So you're going to have your bottom go back. And if you struggle with balance or strength, then hang on to the kitchen sink. And you want to get your bottom as low as it'll go to the chair without your knees coming forward. And you can see my toes are coming up here. I'm balancing on my heels. And that's okay. If you feel that, you're doing it right. And then you push through your heels to come back up, right? And if you're holding on, don't use your arms to pull you back up. Make sure you're pushing through your feet. But this is going to really get max back in order. Now, if you've got a knee or some pain that's happening, try adjusting the position of your feet. Now, this is me not diagnosing anyone or telling anyone what to do, but sometimes just a simple switch of foot position, maybe have the feet go a little bit wider, maybe turn a toe out, just a smidge. We're talking 5 degrees, just a tiny bit. Sometimes that can make a huge difference. If a knee's not happy, just putting that 1 foot forward, like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. Now, obviously, the back leg is going to do more work, but that knee might be happy and you can still train those muscles safely without hurting anything. Ideally, there's never to have any pain when you're doing anything repetitively, because your brain thinks you're trying to hurt yourself and you're not smart enough to not hurt yourself. So your brain tries to find ways to cheat and uses the wrong muscles. So you're not really training functionally, you're training in dysfunction. So it's important that when you're training your body, you're not experiencing pain with repetitions. So that's a really good start to get the back hip working well, right? Now, the interesting part about the back hip, if you remember the glute, right, that nice diagonal line that came down, it also will, because it comes down around here and you've got ITB and all this other side structures, it also will impact your side hip. But we want to make sure we're doing something for the outside hip, right? The outer hip. So a great way to work outer hip is to just step across and then come back. And I know that's very simple, but I'm not sure where anybody is in this thing. And you can always make it a little bit harder. If you have balance issues, holding on is always a good idea. But if you step across and you put that foot down, I'm now loading eccentrically, that outer hip is getting longer, and then I come back to my starting point. So I load and I unload. And there's ways to make this harder, but this is a really good start. And if you're not holding on, and you do that a few times, and if you rest your hands on your hips to give that nice tactile cue, when I come over, if I feel that hip come up on that side, I know I'm really loading that outer hip. So I'm really training it. And I can get that outer hip to really work for me. But the goal, again, is no pain, right? And then what about inner hip? Inner hip tends to be a challenge for a lot of people because they're not even aware that it can be a potential culprit and they don't even really train it. But a lot of people end up with groin strains. They talk about their inner thigh, their adductors, those kind of things. And what they tend, the conventional mindset is to stretch those muscles. Well, what about getting the muscle to eccentrically load in a way where it's happy to do the movement, and you create that nice fluid fill effect, that nice pumping mechanism, and you start to rehabilitate that area of the body, and it starts to perform again because you're not punching it in the nose, You're guiding it back to proper movement. So a nice way to do that is just stepping out to the side. And when you step out to the side, you want to make sure that your foot that's moving is staying forward and you're not turning, because this isn't about rotation. So just stepping out to the side and coming back. That inner thigh, that inner hip on my left side here, your right, if we're mirror image, is now loading as I come over and unloading to bring me back to my starting point. So, and again, you can make these harder, you can make these easier. If you need to hold on, but that's going to train inner hip, right? And then rotation. We want to train external and internal rotation. And we also want to train front hip. So we can do all of these with steps. So front hip would be very simple, just step forward and come back. And that's loading that front hip. If I keep my knee straight and my heel down, that's requiring that front hip to really control my motion as I come forward. Yes, this leg is helping, but this one is really working to pull me back, because when I come forward, it's loading, you'll feel it, and it pulls me back as it unloads. So when you load and unload a muscle, what's happening is that what I said when I was upstairs, that subconscious reaction of a muscle to the movement that you initiate, so that your brain says, oh, everybody's doing their job down there, all's good, right? That's what we want, without us having to think about it. Oh, is my hip, is it extending? Are those, and thinking about all the muscles? It's not meant to be a conscious act, right? The body is supposed to respond subconsciously to movement once it's initiated. So that would be front hip. And then rotation is very simple, just like what I showed about, turning. I'm just going to turn, and that's external rotation of that hip. Now, I always caution people, because a lot of the times people are limited in rotation, especially if they've got pain, chronic issues, low back problems. A lot of the times the reason the low back is complaining is because the hips are not doing their job, or the trunk is lacking mobility. It's very rarely the low back. I kind of joke and say, ignore the low back to fix it, right? But the point is, we want to make sure that we're not hurting ourselves when we do this rotation. So you might want to start off with just a smaller motion and then gradually increase it if it feels okay. Thought I had to sneeze and it went away. So the goal is keep this knee nice and soft. And as you turn, put weight into that leg and that knee bends. So this is where the stress ends up. But this hip is still loading, getting longer in external rotation. And remember, when you looked at those anatomy pictures, you got all those little rotating muscles in there. And they're all getting longer as I do this. And they're loading, and then they're unloading to bring me back. So we want to load and unload. And that's turning away. And then we've got turning in. Same thing. The leg that moves, I'm putting weight into that foot. I'm bending that knee. This knee is soft. And a lot of the times too, with rotation, you might want to start slower, right? Because sometimes people are like, oh, I don't have much. If you can't make a nice 90-degree letter T with your feet, you're lacking internal rotation. And that's a biggie for leading to the need for disposable underwear over the years, all kinds of issues, because those internal rotators really have to be working. And think about it. If you're in the kitchen and you're at the stove and say, I've got to turn here, well, that's internal rotation of that hip. If I've got to turn and grab something off the counter, if I don't have internal rotation, what happens? My brain says, oh, we can't do that turn. So it'll have you do all kinds of funky things so that you don't hurt that hip, but you don't even know you're compensating. You don't even know you're lacking that motion. So a lot of the times people are clueless how much motion they're lacking. It's phenomenal. And when you go to assess them, they're like, oh, I didn't know I was, So you want to be a nice letter L, you want to make a nice letter T, and you've got to have that mobility. If you don't have mobility, then your body's probably lacking some stability, because that's required to be fully mobile. So, but it's important to train your hips in a way that does back hip, front hip, outer hip, inner hip. And you're not just like isolating, laying on the floor and lifting your leg toward the ceiling isn't really functional. I want to ask if anybody in your audience right now can tell me one functional task they perform throughout the day that requires them to lay on their side and lift a leg toward the ceiling. I'm guessing nobody can answer that, right? Yeah, it doesn't happen.
No takers, yeah.
Yeah, but we train that way. Why do we train that way? Because we were told to, because we were taught to, but nobody questioned, well, what does that do for me? Well, you're training your TFL or your ITB or your, whatever, or your gluteus medius, you're training those side muscles. No, you're not. Because those side muscles have to learn how to get longer when you're on your feet to control your motion. So how is laying on your side and lifting your leg up going to do that? It's not, right? There's so many things we do in training our body that are inauthentic. They're not functional. And so not only do they risk us inflaming or annoying body parts, but they don't even train the muscles to work properly. So now we're at a bigger risk of injuring ourselves because our body doesn't know what to do when real life is thrown at it. So, all right.
Well, I think what you said makes so much sense that that's not an activity we do. And when people do their triceps like this, we never go like this in life. I mean, I
love it, AJ. Boy, are you right.
I mean, yes. When do we ever have to? I mean, bicep, I can almost understand. We know you lift things up, your dog, your child. But when does anybody do this?
Yeah.
Never.
But then even with the biceps, if people are isolating them, right? Because you'll pick up a weight and you're going to keep that elbow by your side at 90 degrees and you're going to supinate and you're going to come up and you're going to make sure that you isolate that bicep and you don't let any other muscle help. Well, guess what? The body's designed to work as a team. And so when I go to pick up a heavy box, what am I doing? I'm not going, oh, I better keep my elbows in. I better make sure that I don't use any other muscle. I better just use my biceps. No, of course not. We bend down, we put our weight into our foot, we push through our feet, we use our power source, we lift with our whole body, and our biceps assist the lift, right? They don't isolate the lift. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who have biceps tendonitis, and they go to the gym, 5 days a week because you're isolating the muscle, you're beating it up. It gets inflamed because it says, why aren't you letting anybody else work with me here? Why am I all by myself? It's like the teenager who complains that their sibling doesn't help, right? but it's true. All right.
Let me look if there's questions. What do you think about yin yoga? Because that's very hip centered. A lot of the moves are specifically opening the hips.
I will humbly admit that I know very little about yoga. It's not something that I've ever been drawn to. You know how experts will say the most important exercise you can do in the world is the one you'll do. Yoga just doesn't float my boat. I prefer to be doing other things. It's a beautiful thing. There's lots of data that shows it helps a lot of people resolve things. It's a wonderful activity. I highly encourage and recommend it. You want to make sure your teacher is good at making sure that you know modifications if you can't do the movements, and they're watching you and they're teaching you properly. I've worked with a lot of people who've gotten injured in yoga for one of two reasons. The teacher wasn't all that good of an instructor, or the person didn't want to stand out in class, and so they did a move that they knew they probably shouldn't do, but they didn't want anybody to see them not do it, and they hurt themselves. And that's not the teacher's fault, right? That's on them. So But my point is, I know almost nothing about yoga. So it's hard for me to answer questions about yoga. I apologize for that, but it's just not my expertise.
Well, that's okay. So do you want to answer some questions that have been sent in, even if it's not specifically on a hip? Is that okay, Eileen?
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. So this one actually was from last time and we didn't get to it. I'm sorry, Jan, for missing it. And she said, my question about getting off the floor, not using your hands. Jan says she had knee replacement 5 years ago and still struggling from getting up from the floor. She's in her 70s. She works out every day and goes walking, weather permitting. It's cold in Canada. What else can a person do to help them get up off the floor easier? Good question.
So there's a lot of things. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to tell somebody how they should do it, right? Without me assessing them and seeing where their weak areas are, where their strong areas are. I remember working with a woman who had, she was in her 80s. She'd had an amputation and she was determined to be able to get on and off the floor without her prosthetic leg on. And we worked together, and within 2 or 3 weeks, she was strong enough to get off that floor without assistance, right? So there's a lot of little things that you can try. Let me see if I can demonstrate a couple of little things. And again, this is only if you know it's safe for you, and I don't want anybody hurting themselves. So the goal is, how good are you? I mean, if you've had total knee replacements, doing this is probably not your favorite thing to do, right? So how are you on the floor? What's your starting point if you're not on your knees, right? So, say maybe you're doing yoga. And so this is how you're on your backside. It's very challenging to get up off the floor without going onto your knees. I will tell you that. You can do it, but you've got to have really good flexion and you've got to have good strength. So basically, that's pretty good there, right? And I can do this and I can walk with my hands. And now once I get here, but you might not have that much flexion, so that might be painful. But once I get here, I can kind of lift my bottom, and I'm barely using my hands. And if I lift my bottom up, then I can get up, right? So now I didn't kneel on my knees, but it depends on how much you can bend your knees. There's a lot of different ways to do it. There's ways to kind of rotate as you come up. Moshe Feldenkrais was famous for saying we're rotatory beings. And so, if you try to, well, he was famous for doing a lot of things, but that was one of the things that I learned from his statements. We do rotate. And so sometimes just rotating as you get up, if you watch a toddler get up off the floor, that might give you some good ideas because they tend to rotate as they get up, right? So, but if, getting on and off, if you can get on your knees, if you've got a strong leg, then just put that strong leg under you. And if you feel like you need something to push with your hands because the glutes, the power source isn't there to push you up, then you can just put your hands on your leg and just push up that way. That's a really good way if you're able to be on one knee. It depends on the person's limitations, but there's multiple ways to get up.
Great, thanks. This is from Barbara. She says, Eileen, what is your opinion on the new step machine? I have needed physical therapy several times and they always start me on the new step. I feel it is both building muscle and aerobic.
Okay. So, yeah, if you're doing something repetitively, if there's resistance, then you're definitely going to be building muscle. And if you're doing it for any length of time, then yeah, it is going to do some aerobic benefit for sure.
I don't know what the new step machine is. Can you tell us?
There's so many different machines out there. I think it has to do with you're getting this resistance and it's kind of like you're going up steps. If my memory serves me right, because I'm always researching what the new stuff is, and I'm hoping that my memory is accurate. But it has to do with, and maybe Barbara can confirm that, or she might not be here because she sent the question in. So.
Okay, well, thank you. And here is one from Jane. What are the best exercises for pelvic floor health to prevent the typical issues faced by many women as they age?
Yeah, so as you will see, if you're watching this by recording, I did mention pelvic floor health, right? So what happens as we, it's not really an age thing, it's more an inactivity thing. It's more a way too much sitting and not enough exercise thing, because the hips connect fascially to the muscles that support the organs in the pelvic region, right? And technically, we use the term pelvic floor, but it's really not a floor. It's really kind of like a bowl shape. But those muscles support those organs, especially the bladder. And as the bladder gets full, it can hold up to 2 cups of urine and it gets very heavy. And if the muscles that are supporting it start to drop down because they can't support the weight, that's when the the urethra gets pulled open, the sphincter's open, and you have unwanted leakage. So if you're training the muscles in a way, especially in the hips, weight bearing, it's huge. Weight bearing with hips, a lot of rotation, a lot of weight bearing. It will fascially connect to those muscles that support the bladder and all the other organs. It's the levator ani muscles. It's the obturator internus muscle, for those of you who like to know the muscles of the hips that connect fascially to that levator ani muscle. And it stimulates and triggers the levator ani muscle to strengthen. A lot of people, when they're wheelchair bound, when they're extremely sedentary, they start to have unwanted leakage. A lot of the times, if someone's hips are so bad, they're really in need of a total hip replacement because it's just pure bone on bone and there's nothing left. They're not really doing much walking. They're not really doing much activity. They may see some incontinence occur. And then once they get the joint replaced and they can move again, they'll see the incontinence improve. And then you can also get the flip side. If they get a hip replacement, but they don't rehab it properly, maybe they have some complications. They can't really have full mobility or full strength, doesn't get restored, and they end up with incontinence issues after the replacement. So it's all about activity level, right? And working those muscles. And there's a device that I highly recommend. It was designed by Christina Christie, who's a fellowship at the Applied Functional Science program, which I'm very excited. I've been accepted into the fellowship and I start next week, so I can't wait for that. But she designed this device called the Pelvic Core Pro, and it works beautifully at providing resistance with internal and external rotation of your hips in weight bearing. And I actually teach it. I have a four-class course that I teach in exercising away urinary incontinence without Kegel, and it's very effective. A lot of people find a lot of benefit from it, and it resolves their issues or radically improves them. So yeah, really good question. You don't have to end up going down the disposable underwear aisle when you get older if you remain active and do the right things to train the body.
Well, congratulations on your fellowship.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, I don't know if you know who Dr. Stefan Esser is. He also has a regular slot on this show. He's a sports medicine doctor.
I have to check him out. I've seen his name many times, but I haven't watched any of his content.
I think you'd like him because he's with you. He is like one of the biggest fans of exercise. So there's a question here from Julie, and you're welcome to answer, but I also think it might be a good one for him because he's the guy that actually decides whether or not, to do the surgery. And it seems like she has a frozen shoulder. She says she's 53, vegetarian since 88, vegan since 2009, don't smoke, drink, alcohol, drugs, recreationally or prescription. She's been experiencing mild discomfort in her right shoulder on and off for 4 years. Just last month, her entire right arm locked itself to the right side of her body, and her entire right shoulder and arm were in excruciating pain like she never had before. X-ray revealed a piece of calcium lodged between her shoulder blades. Her diagnosis, calcific tendonitis with frozen shoulder. He suggested surgery because he said the calcium piece will not be absorbed naturally by the body. She doesn't remember having any injuries other than her dog pulling extremely roughly once where it felt like he pulled her shoulder out of the socket. Any input would be appreciated.
So, I mean, I can speak generally. Obviously, I don't want to give specific advice. I've worked with people who were injured because their dog yanked them. I remember one woman who had extensive surgery because of a real bad injury that happened because her very large dog got excited and ran and she dislocated her arm. So it can happen. Adhesive capsulitis is very common, and it's almost always related to some minor injury, some experience prior. I myself ended up with a mild case of it when I was doing pull-ups, and I had dropped just a little too low. I was trying not to make noise because my grandson was staying overnight here, and I didn't want to wake him up. And my gym area is next to the guest area down in the basement where we have the sofa and the TV and all that. And so I remember I went down just a little too low, and I felt a little something when I was doing my pull-ups. And then after a while, it was like it was uncomfortable to try to do certain motions. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, I could do less and less and less. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've developed adhesive capsulitis. It is a horrible thing. It's extremely painful. And typically, if you look it up, if you research it, what you'll read more often is that it can take up to a year, maybe even up to 2 years to resolve. Typically, the pain part of it resolves much more quickly than getting all the range of motion back. I was able to use some really specific trigger point therapy on my shoulder, also a lot of neurofascial work, and I was able to get complete full function back in about 5 months, which is a real short period of time, considering it usually takes a year to 2 years, right? And so, yeah, it's, and then when you add the complexity of the calcium deposits, it is true, you know, that the calcium won't necessarily get resorbed. It depends on where it is and how the body's treated. It won't always resorb what's been placed there, because it kind of did it as a protective mechanism until everything's resolved. So adhesive capsulitis is a huge, nasty bear. I did so much research. I came across one guy in Canada who had some really stellar results, and I was tempted to go to Canada just to meet the guy and see what he did. But it's really challenging. What I would caution is, whenever anyone has shoulder surgery, your shoulder is the most mobile joint in the body. We're really blessed in my area. We have a shoulder surgeon who I would trust doing anything, because you got to remember, in my field, we get the people after surgery. So we know who does well and who doesn't. We know which surgeons have good outcomes and which ones don't, right? We know which ones we wouldn't want to send our family members to because we haven't seen really good outcomes. Well, this particular surgeon, his outcomes were almost always really, really good. And so it's really important that you see somebody who's excellent in shoulders, you know, get lots of recommendations, check their track record, because it's such a complex mobile joint. You want to make sure you have a real consummate expert.
Yeah, thank you. That'd be good if you could get your surgeon recommendations from the physical therapist.
Yes,
first,
yes. His name is Dr.
From...
Leonard Goldstock. He's upstate New York.
Wow.
He's amazing.
Terrific. From Victoria, I have severe osteoarthritis in my left shoulder and right ankle that prevent me from exercising as much as I want. Any suggestions on way to manage the OA?
So as I had talked when I first was a guest on your show, I talked about how OA really does respond to pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory foods, right? The whole, what the person is putting in their mouth. And I know the majority of people who watch your show are whole food, plant-based. Some of them haven't been for very long. It depends on how long they've known you and how long they've followed you, and have they actually applied what they've learned from you, right? There's a lot of variables. So, so I would say food is the biggest source. You know, there are some natural anti-inflammatory supplements, if you want to call them that, but I would never recommend those over a general show like this. The number one goal, and from what I've seen from people, and this is just my observation and my experience, you know, professional and personal. A lot of the times I don't want to say assume, but we believe that the pain is because of arthritic changes that are showing on X-ray. But a lot of the times it's not the arthritis that's causing the pain. A lot of the times what's causing the pain is the lack of proper three-plane function in those joints, or the joints above or below. So it's important. What I found is, when I train people in three-plane function and we figure out what they can do successfully, no matter how small we start, and they build on that, it restores a lot of things, and the pain is not a problem. And so what I say is, well, I didn't wave a magic wand over their arthritis, right? So the arthritis wasn't necessarily inhibiting the movement. It was the improper training or not knowing where to train. So that's key. Finding somebody who understands three-plane function, you know, whatever area this person is in. I highly recommend, you know, contacting the Gray Institute. It's GRAY. They train healthcare professionals, you know, physical therapists, athletic trainers, specialists in three-plane function. And if you find somebody who's certified in applied functional science through them, then they're going to be able to look at you as a whole body, and they're going to be able to figure out what planes are not working efficiently, and they might be able to get you started training in a way that doesn't elicit pain in those areas where you have limits and restore some function to those areas.
That's great. Thank you. From Susan, it seems I have pulled my piriformis muscle. It seems to be getting better, but I was wondering, how did I strain it and what should I do to let it heal? I don't sit a lot and I've been taking it easy on the lunges and squats.
So the piriformis is a very deep muscle in the butt, and it goes from the sacrum, which is that upside down triangle at the bottom of the spine, with the point being the tailbone. So it goes from the side of the sacrum, kind of the front of it, along diagonal along the back hip, right out to that greater trochanter that I talked about earlier. And, it's very deep. It's underneath the max, right? Underneath a lot of the others. That was that one that I showed that was kind of next to the nerve. Although, did I show that last week? I teach so many classes, I forgot what I showed earlier. But the goal is the piriformis can be a culprit as far as how your pelvis is positioned. So sometimes what can trigger a piriformis, and this is not me saying this is you, but just generally speaking, sometimes what can trigger a piriformis is if a person is in just a minor little fender bender in their car because their foot's on the brake, right? Maybe they're sitting at a red light and they get rear-ended, or they're in a parking lot and, there's this little fender bender that happens. And usually when you're in a parking lot, your foot's hovering over the brake. And so what happens is that you get this force enters the pelvis because of the one foot being stopped, and the sacrum kind of torques just a little bit. And sometimes it can't get itself back because bone is a slave of muscle. And if the muscle kind of doesn't know how to get it back in place, it just kind of sits there. Well, because the piriformis attaches to the sacrum, if the sacrum is in a wrong position, even if it's like 1/8 of an inch, that's enough for the muscle to say, okay, stop yanking on me. And the muscle wants to pull back. It kind of creates this kind of a low level tug of war between the bone and the muscle. And that's what will make the piriformis not happy. So what I've seen, excuse me, in my practice, a lot of the times, the reason the piriformis isn't happy is because of a sacral torsion. You address that with a muscle energy technique, which resolves it very simply and quickly and easily. And then if the piriformis is still unhappy, you do a 90-second strain and counter strain to calm it down. And typically all is good. I mean, ideally, if that's the reason it's not happy, it's like a 5-minute correction. It's very simple and easy to do, but you've got to find somebody who's trained in those techniques, right? Otherwise, the old-fashioned thing is to stretch the piriformis. But what I've found is instead of trying to make a muscle longer that's not happy, that's in spasm, try making the muscle shorter and getting it kind of like, a rubber band. You put it on slack and let it relax. And then it may be happier to get longer. So, and because the piriformis is part of it, gets longer when you internally rotate, it gets longer. Try just kind of, turning out and just letting it relax. A lot of the times I've had patients come into the clinic who I put them in a position to calm down the muscle, and they'd go, oh, that's the position I get into on my bed. It just felt like instinct to try to calm the muscle down. I go, yeah, your brain knows what to do. So sometimes just lying on your stomach and bringing your leg up by your side, kind of like a chicken wing, and letting it, kind of lay flat next to you, that shortens the piriformis, and that can allow it to just kind of say, and relax. Sometimes that can be enough.
Nice. Thank you. This is from Jerry. Can you compare exercising with a resistance flex band and weights, and do they both have a positive effect on bone health?
So bone health has to do with making sure you're weight bearing. Obviously, again, food, huge issue, right? You don't want to be consuming a high acid, low diet, lots of animal protein, and because that's going to take calcium from the bones. And I tell people they're literally peeing their bones down the toilet, which nobody wants to do. So diet aside, the more stress you place on your body, the stronger your bones are. Weightlifters have the densest bones. It's a given in the data. It's been shown. So, and it doesn't matter. The nice thing is it doesn't matter how old you are. You can always increase the density of your bones, whether you're 80 or 90 years old, because that cellular response is always there as long as you're above ground. So ideally, there is a difference between using a TheraBand and a free weight, right? Again, it depends on your goals. There are some ways, excuse me, that you might want to train your body in a way where the TheraBand might make more sense. It depends on your goals. You know, if you attach the TheraBand over the top of a doorway and you, I don't know if I can, say this was on top of a doorway and I want to just build the back of my shoulder and I come down, but you can see I'm using my whole body. So I'm now working the back of my shoulder girdle. But what this is doing is it gives me resistance coming down through the motion, and it increasingly gets more. And then it helps to lift my arm up. So I love using TheraBand for people who are trying to rehab something, because when they return to their starting point, the TheraBand kind of provides this assist. So it's a great rehab tool. It really is. Free weights, that's a whole different story, right? But anything that requires the body to perform strength against resistance is going to be good for the bones.
Nice. Thank you. Boy, Karen, this is a question you sent in a while back, and I'm so sorry. Sometimes they just get stuck in the queue, but I found it. Since I lost all my weight, I have a lot of pain with my tailbone. It may be because my chair seat is too deep, so I can't sit up straight. Any suggestions? It does also hurt when I'm in a straight back chair.
Okay, so when we're sitting in a chair, our pelvis can either be anterior or posterior. Right? So if I'm sitting in a chair, there are a couple of ways that I can sit. And of course, it depends on your seat, right? I love this. This was a relatively inexpensive seat. I bought a bunch of these for a space that I rented where I was doing some teaching for a while. And because it would hold up to, I think it would hold like 350 pounds, which it doesn't look like it would do that. But it's very, very comfortable. It just really helps you stay in a good posture. So, chairs matter, right? How you're sitting. But when you're sitting, tailbone is different than sits bones. Ideally, you want to be sitting on your sits bones, not your tailbone. And so you might be, and again, this is not me advising you, I'm just saying how to change position of the pelvis. So if I do a posterior tilt, where I kind of round out my low back against the seat, and you can see my legs will shift forward a little bit. Now I'm sitting more on my sits bones, but my low back is rounded out, right? And that's not necessarily a good thing to stay in forever, but you may be able to get more pressure on the sits bones and off the tailbone, because that's ideal. If you go into more of an anterior tilt, where your kind of belly comes forward and you're sticking your tail out like a happy bunny kind of a thing, that's going to put more pressure more toward, depending on where you're sitting in the seat, that'll kind of pull you away from the tailbone, and that might be more comfortable. It's again, without seeing the person and knowing what their limits are, it's hard to say, but you've got those options of that posterior tilt and anterior tilt, and kind of see what position kind of gets off that area and feels better.
Right. Thank you. Susanna says she's using you for low back pain and you're helping her so much and that you're brilliant. And Alma wants to know if Tai Chi exercises are good, especially for hips.
Tai Chi has been around for quite a while, and I've never physically done it myself, but I have looked at the research and how effective it is. And it really does help, especially as people age. It helps for strength. It helps for mobility. It helps for stability. It has a lot of benefits. Yes, because there's a lot of fluid movements. There's no herky-jerky, micro whiplash of things. Yeah.
All right.
And it's all weight bearing.
People are saying the link to the free membership isn't working, and I only cut and paste your links. So maybe after the show, you can look at the show notes and just tell me if I have it wrong, because I literally just cut and paste whatever I'm sent. So,
okay, are they talking for the boot camp or for the private club?
I think they're saying for the both. So I literally just cut and paste what you send. So maybe after the show, when you can get to the computer, you can just tell me if perhaps
something might have
Yeah.
Got
'cause I
lost
can't-
in
I
the
can't fix it.
translation.
Yeah, I can't fix it right now if I don't know what it is. And then Angela had a question. I saw it a minute ago. Can you suggest a current book on kinesiology regarding muscle attachment and attachments and actions?
Oh my goodness, that is so funny. I just, when I was teaching my academy class earlier today, I showed them my favorite anatomy book. It's by Joseph Muscolino, Muscolino. It is one of the best anatomy books I've seen where he actually talks about eccentric function of muscles. He doesn't focus on the agonist antagonist. He does mention some of it in there, but it's one of the best anatomy books I've seen where it really explains the functional activity of muscles in like real life. It's not 100% spot on, but it's really close. It's the best I've found. So that's so funny that question gets asked because I was just sharing that with somebody.
Great. And then here's a question from Vivi. You mentioned Feldenkrais earlier. How do you think about this exercise, comparing it to physical therapy?
Well, it depends. Moshe Feldenkrais has been dead for quite some time. So it depends where this person's learning this. Is the person who's teaching them Feldenkrais work actually certified in it? There is the Feldenkrais, I don't know if it's called a foundation or institute. I think it's the institute. I studied under Tom Myers, who studied directly under Moshe Feldenkrais. So, he's a stellar expert. He resides in Maine right now. He still does teaching. He's got a great website. If you look up Tom Myers, I think it's Myers. There might be Mey, but he's an anatomy expert. He wrote anatomy trains. So Moshe Feldenkrais was an icon when it came to addressing things like kids who had scissors legs. They had all, CP, they were spastic. They just, he had this beautiful way of getting these kids to move. And he taught this to professionals and created this whole training, this whole education. I loved the training that I took. It was from Tom Myers and Joseph Delagrat, where in Boston, I went for an entire weekend for like 6 months in a row. And it was incredible training. Moshe Feldenkrais, he was brilliant beyond when it came to just really fluid human movement and lots of rotation and very soft movements and just restoring things. Yeah, really, really good.
Nice, thanks. Here's a question from a live viewer named Elizabeth. During a recent cold, I was coughing a lot and became incontinent, not just when coughing, but throughout the day. Now that I'm better, I am in full control. How can I prevent this from happening?
Well, again, training the hip muscles to make sure the pelvic floor is strong enough. That, there's different types of incontinence. There's stress incontinence, which is coughing, sneezing, lifting something heavy, jumping. So, and then there's urge incontinence. Those are the people who, as soon as they have to go, they better hurry up and get there because they're not going to make it in time, right? So there's different types of incontinence, but they all tend to have the same issue unless the person has neurological damage, they've had some type of physical injury. It's really training that pelvic floor in a way where your hips are weight bearing and you're resisting pushing out, resisting pushing in. There's beautiful ways to train the body to make sure that pelvic floor doesn't surprise you like that the next time that you cough or sneeze. Yes.
Great. Thank you. And Mona says, do you have any workout graphics someone could purchase?
Workout graphics? I'm not sure. Are they talking about pictures?
I'm
not quite sure what they mean. Yeah. If they mean still pictures, I don't really... I prefer video because I've seen, I've been teaching people how to move now for almost 30 years. And what I've seen is it's very hard to learn how to do a movement from a still picture, right? Even if you got, this is the starting point, this is the ending point, there's no showing how to get there from point A to point B, right? And people tend to do it wrong a lot of the times, more wrong than right. And so that's why I prefer videos. That's why I've got my YouTube channel, I've got my online sites, free memberships, and I do all the free events because I want to show people how to do the movements, and I want to teach modifications for people who, if they do what I'm showing and they can't do it without pain or problem, I need to show them how to accomplish it and eliminate the pain or the problem. So yeah, I prefer live video.
Thank you. And thank you, Angela, for the super chat. Any idea what you're going to talk about next month?
Next time, I think I'd like to focus on the back, because as I said, the back is that ignore the back to fix the pain, right? Because people don't understand just how much the back is impacted. Your back can be the strongest link in your body if you train it properly from above and below. And I think people need to know that.
Great. Oh, question just came in from Sheila. What exercise machine is best to start a home gym? One guest, Dr. Curtis Rimmerman, recommended a rowing machine, and we bought one based on his recommendations.
Yes, yeah. Rowing machines are really good because you are working the whole body as you come forward. You're getting that beautiful leg press. You're getting the shoulder girdle. So that's a really nice all around working the body. Anything else you use is not going to work the whole body that way. Obviously, a stationary bike is mostly legs, right? Even that one, I can get my arms involved and I can do resistance, but I think the rowing machine is probably a really good, but some people have shoulder issues. They've got issues where they can't do a rowing machine, right? So again, it always comes down to what is it that you can do to get started.
Well, he hasn't set it up yet, so it really was for him. I do my spin bike, but you're right, the spin bike isn't doing anything for my upper body. So,
right.
Yep. Well, this was great. I really enjoy watching you do these exercises and learning from you. It's really what a fascinating career it must be to be a physical therapist.
It is. It really. There's a lot of satisfaction. Yes, great job satisfaction. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, because people get better, and even if they don't get 100% better, they're moving towards getting better. So I think it's great. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. And we'll see you next month, Eileen.
All right. Thanks, AJ. Bye, everybody.
Take care. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow for the Lifestyle Docs, Dr. Chawla and Dr. Chawla. And make sure, get your questions.